where we're going to focus on some of the unsung heroes of the world of sports, the beat writers, and the lessons that they can provide us with the unique perspective they have from seeing the teams every single day. I'm Chris Spags, and we're joined today by the man who's the inspiration for this idea, one of the preeminent beat writers who works for the Pistons and the Detroit News, Mr. Rod Beard, at Twitter, at @DetNewsRodBeard. How you doing, Rod?
Good. Thanks for having me on. This is a really good idea. I hope it works out for you guys.
If nothing else, we're going to have the tensions between the communities of beat writers and DFS players soothed over this hour. And on the DFS side, we have the number one player in the world, the founder of Osmo.com, the website that employs me, and I'm very grateful for that. Alex Baker, better known to all you guys as Osmo. How are you doing, Alex?
Doing great. Really excited for the new NBA season. NBA fantasy is one of the most exciting to play on a day-to-day basis. Rod, thanks for being on the show. It's really exciting because I know you have a reputation in the DFS community of being a guy who is who caters more to the game and doesn't kind of isn't a hater. You know what I mean?
No, and that was something I just stumbled into. It wasn't an intentional sort of thing, but when people just started asking me random stuff like how many minutes is Ish Smith going to play or Boban, I mean, those are the two Pistons DFS darlings. But when people started asking about that, it caught my interest. And the more I dug into it, the more I researched and tried to figure things out, the more intriguing it got. So it's been a good foray for me to learn some new things and just burst into a new community completely.
So we're going to talk a ton of NBA. Obviously, it is NBA opening night. We're going to pick Rod's brain about a lot of things. But before that, I wanted to give you guys one thing to talk about because Alex mentioned how, Rod, you and him had met. And it's through the work that you both have done for the Academic Games League of America. And it seems like a very worthwhile cause that you both care a ton about. So, Rod, do you want to tell the people, I guess, what that is and how they could participate?
Yeah, I'm the executive director and also the national tournament director. And it's something that I've done since I was in fourth or fifth grade. But it's academic competitions and interscholastic. You play against other kids from other schools. And they're math games, social studies games, language arts games. But you compete in three-person groups, and it improves your math skills, it improves all of your skills, your teamwork skills, and everything else. Certainly a worthwhile endeavor for anybody to participate in. But our website is academicgames.org if you want to get more information about what we're doing there. And it is just an awesome thing. It's where I met Alex and where I've met just hundreds and hundreds of friends, and we've impacted tens of thousands of kids over the years.
That's awesome. Yeah, Alex, you want to give a quick word because you're volunteering there. People don't know Alex does have a lot of passions besides taking all your money in the world of DFS. Alex, what do you think about it all?
Yeah, I mean, Academic Games was really big in my development. Kind of, it's a place where you can use your competitive spirit in academics, which isn't very common, especially starting at the middle school level. And Rod actually was one of the greatest Academic Games players of all time. So we're actually lucky that he's not a DFS player yet because I feel like a lot of the skills are the same to winning in academics and winning at DFS.
There you go. We're glad to not have him on the table. He's got to be a professional journalist. He can't be participating in these dog and pony shows that we have. Let's set the table a little bit and let's take people into kind of the overall view of beat writers and how they work within the daily fantasy sports ecosystem. Rod, is one of the more prominent names in the space and somebody who's, taken an interest in it and dug deeper to learn more and to get better at that side of things. How do you perceive that relationship with your experiences?
Well, it's still growing, and I think there's plenty of space for more beat writers to get involved with that. It's not where it needs to be because people just don't understand. And as beat writers, our days are kind of mapped out for us, whether it's a shoot around on a game day, whether it's a practice in between those game days. So we have certain things that we need to get done at certain times, especially if you're writing for a newspaper and you've got a regular deadline. You just don't have time for the extra questions of, again, how many minutes is Andre Drummond going to play? Is Reggie Jackson's knee healthy? Those are sorts of questions that we can answer piece by piece. But then when you get 10 or 15 people, much less 100 people who are wondering the same thing, you've got to figure out a way to rejigger your schedule to make that work. And I've kind of done that. And after every practice or shoot around, I'll tweet, hey, here's the injury report. And then here's minutes, if the coaches even talk about minutes. I don't typically ask about minutes specifically, but I'll say, hey, is this guy hurt or do you plan on a regular rotation? And that gives the indication of where things are going to go that night.
What do you think is the best way for DFS players to utilize the knowledge that you guys pick up when you're out there in the field and you're seeing these things? Obviously, some people can be a little intrusive with you guys and a little expecting more of you than perhaps your job is covering. But what's the best way to use you guys as a positive resource and maybe even contribute to the discussion?
Well, I think the biggest hint that I can give people is just respect what I said before. Respect the fact that there's a schedule and there's time. And even if it's just a simple question here, hey, what do you think about this guy? What do you think he's going to play? Especially if it's a guy who hasn't played a lot and he might see a big jump in minutes. That's a legitimate question, both from the beat writing side, but then also from the DFS side. So that would be the one hint I would give players if they're trying to figure out how to approach their beat writer, how to get more information there, is ask it, understand if they don't answer it, but don't continue to bug them. Usually if they're interested and they're going to help you out, they'll do it the first time you ask. If you continue to ask them, you'll get blocked or anything like that. But I think the best way to kind of look at it is check right before a game, before things lock, before your roster's locked. You can check and see what the injury reports are. If there's anything different in a starting lineup, they'll know it maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And I know that's what causes DFS players to sweat a little bit more, is wondering where a guy is. But even maybe an hour, 2 hours before tip, if you want to DM a guy or add a beat writer and say, hey, what do you think about this guy's opportunity to play tonight? Or how's that injury update? They might be a little bit more willing closer to game time because they're maybe not on the same deadline that they would have been.
Alex, obviously you're a top DFS player, and besides the personal access you might have to Rod now, I'm sure you've come across a couple of beat writers in your day. How do you approach it as a DFS player? I mean, how do you approach that dynamic, and what are you looking for out of beat writers when you're following them and engaging with them?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I asked Rod if he could give me some inside info, but he said he didn't have any, so I was kind of out of luck there. But I think beat writers, they can give a lot of information because they're experts with the sport in a way that's different than a DFS player, where a guy like me, we're analyzing statistics, kind of trying to predict what will happen in the next game based on what's happened up to now. But like a sports reporter, they're there at the game, watching every single game. They're seeing a lot of things that won't come across in the box score. And I know that Rod talks a lot in his writing about the MOET, the my own eye test. And I found that really interesting because it's drawing a contrast between what's popping out in the stats. Like, for example, Boban Marjanovic, he's a killer offensive player, but according to Rod's eye test, he might not be that good for the team overall. And that's the kind of thing that I think is really valuable, because a lot of times you're going to want to predict what will happen before you actually see it happen. Like a player is out for injury, who's going to take those minutes? A beat writer is going to have the expertise to really answer that question, whereas it might not be answerable unless you go back and watch a ton of game film or follow the teams pretty closely.
Yeah, Rod, as Alex mentioned, your eye test is one of the popular things you talk about, the Moet that you have on Twitter. It's become a bit of your brand online. I guess, how do you approach that? Because you're basically merging what you see with the eye test with the kind of data side of things. How did you first come across the data, and how did it inform your process as somebody who, sees these guys up close and develops a pretty good opinion from that?
Well, it's just watching things like practice. And one very good one I got last year was Andre Drummond working on free throws in practice. And in practice, he'd hit 9, 10 in a row. He might hit 70% in practice, or 80% even, but it just didn't translate into games, where he was still somewhere around 40% going into last season. But then you started to see a few more of them fall in his technique and his concentration and focus, and even the mechanics. And you see that, hey, at some point, this is going to look a little bit better. When these free throws start falling and he gets more confidence in it and he gets on a good roll, that number is going to go up. And for him, that could mean 2, 3, 4 more points a game. And even last season, up to 15 points a game. Yeah, that's pretty significant. And even in the way that Stan Van Gundy was using him, in having him facilitate the offense, you knew the assists were going to go up a couple of points. And he averaged a career-high 3 assists last year. But it was just in the way that he was being used, some things that you look at in when practice is over that give you some indications about how a player is going to be used. And I know for a lot of DFS players, usage rate is a big mathematical equation that they look at, or percentage that they look at, and say, how much does this guy touch the ball? That's going to translate to how likely he is. And again, more complex formulas about what his cost is and how you're going to look at using him in that lineup. Those things all kind of go together. But I look at, what do I see that is different than maybe in previous years? What has he worked on in the summer? And now that we're getting to the start of the season, how are those things going to translate into production on the court, which in turn for DFS players means more points?
Well, obviously, you know the Pistons better than anybody. Is there anybody who you've seen with the work they've put in so far? I mean, you mentioned Andre Drummond in previous years, but who is there? Anybody who's jumping out off the page to you as being like, oh, this guy really put in the work, and you could tell that his game's kind of rounding into form.
Well, I think the two players that I watched this year, and they should have very reasonable salaries, especially at the beginning of the year. One is Langston Galloway, and he was buried on the bench almost under Van Gundy's last year. But now Dwane Casey sees him as a professional shooter, a professional scorer, and a guy who's going to be in the rotation again, and maybe even as a seventh or eighth guy off the bench. So he's going to see more time. And exactly how it works, we don't know yet, but we've seen in the preseason that Casey's going to use some four-guard offenses, some three-point guard rotations where Galloway's going to get more minutes. So I haven't seen any of the salaries just yet of what that's going to look like, but Galloway is one guy you definitely want to look at in the first few games until the salary catches up with his production. And then the other is Ish Smith, where he's added the three-pointer to his game, and it's become a more integral part of what he's doing offensively. A lot of teams will go under on pick and rolls with him, and they leave that three-pointer open for him. In the last preseason game, he hit 4 out of 6 from 3. So all of that work he put in the summer is starting to show and to pay off a little bit more. But again, if you're getting that +1 on three-pointers for Ish, that's 4 points a game maybe that he's going to get in addition to that. And again, if you're running more three-guard offense or four-guard offense under Casey, you can look at Ish, Langston Galloway, Luke Kennard as guys that you might want to consider because they'll get more playing time.
I love Ish. Ish has always been one of my favorite guys. He's such an energy guy, dating back to when he was on the Sixers. So, I mean, if he does add that three-point game, that's another thing where you're talking about the eye test. If he adds a three-point game, that also opens lanes for him to drive, which he's also excellent at, both in creating offense for himself and other players. And I think that's something, too, where, it's combining the thought processes of both worlds can definitely add value when you're thinking about it from a DFS perspective.
Absolutely.
Alex, what do you think about that kind of stuff?
So I've been really looking at some of Rod's writing, and I found some really interesting nuggets. One that I feel like has some big DFS implications. Obviously, Dwane Casey, he's running a different offense than Stan Van Gundy. You mentioned in one of your interviews that the offense is no longer going to be like just pick and roll where Reggie Jackson and Andre Drummond run the pick and roll. You're saying that Dwane Casey is stressing a lot more ball movement, less dribbling. So I'm kind of wondering, what do you think that's going to mean as far as like the statistical performance of other players? Like, are the outside shooters going to get more shots because the ball's moving? Is Reggie going to get less because he's not handling the pick and roll as much? What do you think?
Well, I think Reggie's the interesting case in this, and people may want to fade Reggie a little bit until they see exactly how he's going to be used. Because even in those four-guard sets, Ish Smith was the point guard, but Reggie was a more than capable shooter out on the perimeter. So if you like Reggie Jackson's three-point shooting, that works a little bit better. And in those two-point guard sets, now you have a guy who can create and penetrate on either side of the court. So even when you swing the ball around, you still got Reggie who can be very useful and very efficient for you, either from three or creating a pick and roll on the other side of the court. So he's going to be interesting. I don't know if I'm all in on Reggie from a DFS perspective, at least for now, but I am on Ish, and I certainly am on Langston Galloway because he'll get more minutes, at least in the beginning, until they figure some of these things out. But from a general perspective, you're right. With that guard disposition in the back and playing more guards, you're going to see more threes. They had one game where they had 44 threes. Last year, they averaged 29 threes a game, and I think they were 16th or 18th, somewhere in the middle of the pack of the league. If they can get up in the high 30s to 40s of threes a game, that's going to change the dynamic of how all this works. And I mean, Andre Drummond is in the middle of that too. He's adding the three-pointer to his game. So that's another thing that you want to look at. I think Drummond is just going to have an absolute breakout year, all-star type year, not only from his typical scoring and rebounding, but from an all-around perspective. If he starts adding that three and those start falling, he's going to be a guy that the price is going to go up, but he's going to be very much worth it.
How you're feeling about Blake Griffin going into his first full season, his first full camp? I mean, there's a lot of things. I think maybe some of the dark clouds around the Van Gundy era being on. I don't know if that's anything you would want to discuss, but it seemed like maybe people weren't the happiest at the end of that run there. There's a lot of change there. Do you think it's going to help Blake out and help the Blake Drummond dynamic out?
I think it does. The Blake piece of it, I talked to him the other day, and he was saying it's just getting to know Andre Drummond in the offseason was one of the biggest things because they had to know where each other's buttons were, how to get along off the court as well as on the court. And with two big men, there aren't very many teams in the league who have that type of dynamic and that type of roster where two of their best players are big men that way. So it took some time for them to figure it out, but I think they're there now. In that last preseason game, Blake had 29 points, and he looked like the old Blake. He had 3 dunks in one game, which we hadn't seen with the Pistons yet. I don't know if he had 3 dunks, period, in the 25 games he played last season, much less in one game. But he showed the whole repertoire with the jumper, with the drive, the pump fake, and everything else. If he can shoot 35, 40% from 3, then that's a guy, again, that you're going to want to consider. But from everything that I've seen, Blake's salaries have been extremely, extremely high, and it's going to be tough for him on a night-to-night basis to give you value on that. If you're looking for 4X or 5X on Blake Griffin, it's going to be really, really tough. If he's somewhere around 8,000, 9,000 a night, that's just really, really tough for him to bring in. And if you're looking for value bets, Blake Griffin is certainly not at the top of that value list.
While we're talking about teams that you've seen, you obviously saw a couple of other teams during the preseason who were playing different rotations, so maybe not perfectly analogous to what we'll see during the regular season. But you saw the Thunder who are playing tonight, and I guess that might be relevant to some folks in the chat right now. Was there anything you saw with the Thunder that stuck out with their new look with Westbrook on the sideline and Schroeder getting to run things?
No, you saw that what you can get out of Paul George, that he's going to be a versatile piece, and when Russ comes back, he'll share that load a little bit, but he can still be the 1A alpha dog and carry that team for a little bit. Without Carmelo, that's going to be a team that's going to spread that scoring around a little bit more. And you'd think that Paul George would take some of that. Certainly, Westbrook's going to get his share of that. But where does the rest of that fall is the next big question in that. So I think it's hard to read when you don't have Westbrook there because he's so ball dominant. He does so many things that they're just going to be a shell of themselves without him on the court.
So one of the really popular players tonight from the Thunder, we have him projected for 19% ownership on DraftKings, is Hamidou Diallo. And I'm assuming most people didn't watch the preseason and haven't really seen this guy. But do you think he's going to be a big part of the Thunder's rotation, or is this kind of like people are they taking too much from the preseason?
No, I think that's fair. That's a fair assessment that he's going to be certainly part of the rotation. And again, how much he's going to play is the big question mark there. And for a lot of the rookies, a lot of the young players, that's going to be the big question mark, especially early in the season, is are the salaries going to match up with that production? And you might need a game or two or maybe a week or two to figure out how those things balance out. Hamidou Diallo is a guy, again, depending on what his salary is and what the cost is, you may want to just take a look at the first couple of nights. Because again, without Westbrook, they're a different team and they're going to have to get that production from somewhere.
Was there anybody else that you saw on the opposing teams who stood out to you as maybe like another guy who's taking the leap? And I mean, there are a lot of young guys you saw, I think, in some of these teams, especially with the teams resting their starters and just, generally being kind of lackadaisical in the preseason. What jumped out to you, Rod?
No, the one guy that I really like is Karis LeVert from the Brooklyn Nets, and the Pistons will see him tomorrow.
Did we lose audio?
I think we're frozen here for a second.
Oh, no.
I can hear you guys fine, just FYI.
All right, we might have lost Rod for a second. Rod, you there?
Big Karis LeVert fan for tomorrow, though.
That is the important part. Look, Karis deserves a cosign. I'm on board with Karis.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm kind of curious about, the Pistons have always kind of been a team that isn't great for fantasy because they play at a pretty slow pace. But I'm wondering if like having Casey in as coach is going to change that, because I feel like the coach kind of dictates the style of play. And Rod was saying there's a lot of emphasis on people taking open shots early in the clock and then passing the ball around a lot and not dribbling a ton. So Rod, do you think like I was just saying how the Pistons pace might change with Casey kind of emphasizing more ball movement and less pick and roll. So the Nets always play at one of the highest paces in the league. So do you think that the matchup tomorrow will be even better than it might have been in previous years?
I think so. I think it's going to be an up and down game, and we saw that in the preseason. It was a 110 and 108 game in overtime, and nobody likes overtime preseason basketball. But I think it showed what both teams can do. That Pistons weren't really on that night. That was the game that Drummond didn't play so well. I think he had 14 and 10, and he was in foul trouble and struggled. So, but the Nets pace, and again, those young guys, and they're not necessarily playing for now. They're not a playoff team that's going to really knock your socks off immediately. But they're really trying to see who their key players are, D'Angelo Russell, if that's going to be a guy. Jared Allen is another guy with them that I think is going to have another breakout year.
How much do you buy into some of the preseason performances? Because we've talked about Coach Casey bringing perhaps a more up-tempo style, but in the preseason, the team was actually pretty low down the pecking order in terms of pace, second slowest in the league, right? Oddly ahead of the Suns, who've also taken a pretty big shift with their new coach. I guess, how much do you buy into that stuff, and how much do you buy into the coach speak in which Casey says, like, oh yeah, I want to move the ball, I want to make it faster, but they're still kind of running at a slower pace than you might expect?
No, I buy into it a little bit, but the preseason is so vanilla. Teams don't want to show you the sets that they're going to run. And especially for the Pistons, they just want to get out in transition and run and take any open three, any good open three that they can. One interesting thing about Dwane Casey is he talks about this shot spectrum, and he hasn't given us all the detail for it, but he said there's a certain number of three-pointers they want to take a game. There's a certain number of paint twos, and they only want to take a handful of long mid-range jumper twos. And that number might be 4, 5, 6 per game. In that first preseason game against OKC, they only had 5 shots that were either outside of the paint or inside the three-point line. And that's what he's trying to do. Analytically, those are the best shots, and they're going to create opportunities, again, either from beyond the three-point arc or in the paint. And that's where Griffin and Andre Drummond are going to eat a lot, and they're going to have to find other ways to score from that three-point line, because the paint is going to be clogged with teams that are just daring them to shoot until they can prove they can make those shots.
Interesting. I think Dwane Casey's in a good spot this year, and I think that team has the shooters to back out his promises. Reggie Bullock, a guy too I like a lot. I guess just your quick thoughts on him, because he's a guy who I think, based on what you're saying, to me seems like he should be the main beneficiary of that starting unit. How are you feeling about his prospects this year?
He just needs to have another year like last year. He was second in the league overall in three-point shooting at about 45%. And he's just steady. He doesn't do a lot of very flashy things, but he comes out and hits threes. He plays solid defense, and he cuts more than anybody I think I've seen in the NBA. Off the ball, if you watch him, he said he learned that at North Carolina, that he gets to the basket, and if you catch him on a back screen, he can get you a quick bucket there. I think he's going to average about the same, somewhere around 12, 15 points. And if he can shoot the same around 40, 42%, not even up to 45 like he did last year, 40, 42% would be another good solid year for him. And he's in a contract year. He'll be an unrestricted free agent. So he's got the motivation and the impetus to want to do it.
Interesting. I just want to give my boy Reggie Bullock a shout out. I feel like he deserves it.
No, he's good.
Other guys are getting props.
He is very good people.
He was good last year. He did win me some money occasionally. We talked a lot about the Pistons so far. I guess, Rod, across the league, there's been a couple of interesting coaching changes. Who are the other coaches who jump out to you as possibly being a really different philosophical approach to how they're handling things?
Nobody jumps out as being specifically different. I think it's just going to be how they manage their rosters is the thing. And certainly the same thing happened with Casey coming over. Nick Nurse, I think it's the players that moved is going to be, that's what's going to drive that a little bit more. You had DeMar DeRozan in Toronto, and now you're moving to Kawhi Leonard. Nick Nurse is taking over for Dwane Casey up there. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch, is how that dynamic goes. You've got one wing player who sacrificed a lot of his mid-range twos, and Dwane Casey talks about how DeMar DeRozan was one of the better mid-range jump shooters in the league, and he had to tell him, hey, with this shot spectrum, we don't want you taking mid-range twos. Either get all the way to the basket or find a better shot for yourself or for somebody else. So I think Toronto might be the biggest one that I'm just looking at to see how all of these pieces are going to fit together. And again, when you bring in a new piece like that, how long does he take to adjust? Kawhi Leonard's not a big personality, but he's a big piece of that offense and on the defensive end. How quick does he adjust to everything that's going on there? Coaching-wise, I don't think there are going to be too many drastic changes, but when you see players moving from one spot to another, Golden State, another example, when DeMarcus Cousins comes back, how does he fit in with the rest of their offense? I think those player movements are a little bit more critical.
So I've been looking into it recently because obviously, knowing the pace of a team can really help. We were talking about how the Suns were really slow in the preseason, and I saw that they signed Igor Kokoskov as their coach. And also they added DeAndre Ayton, who's obviously going to be one of the huge parts, along with Devin Booker, of the offense. But they brought him over from the Jazz, where he was an assistant. And the Jazz were one of the slowest teams in the league. So do you feel like that is like more of a culture thing, or is that just like the Jazz's personnel like really is geared more towards the slow pace, where the Suns might be more of a young team that can run the floor?
Yeah, I think the Suns are going to be, again, in the same way that we talked about the Nets, that they're not going to be serious about winning just yet. They're just trying to establish who are the players that we can count on. What role is DeAndre Ayton going to play? And as the number one pick, they're going to heap a lot of expectation on him to come in and be immediately effective. So they're going to run stuff for him. While Devin Booker is out with that hand issue, they've got to figure out a way to get points on the scoreboard. And they signed Jamal Crawford the other day, so that's going to be another big addition.
Ooh, cutting out.
Oh, Rod said he was in New York. I assume that's for the Pistons game tomorrow. They're playing Brooklyn. I guess the hotel internet isn't all that great.
Yeah. No, they treat the beat writers that well enough. They need to give them better connections everywhere they go.
Yeah, I mean.
All right. Very good.
Okay.
Just Rod comes back to hear himself getting roasted for a second. Sorry, Rod. We were saying they need to give you better connections on the road. They need to treat you guys like the valuable sources that you are.
No, it's just a spotty Wi-Fi connection that kind of goes in and out. So I'm trying to connect through my cellular, which is a little bit in and out too because I'm in the house. But yeah, I think Phoenix is going to be a team that to look at from a coaching perspective, what type of system he wants to bring in. But they're just going to run and gun. It's not a playoff team right now, but they're just going to run and gun and see, again, Josh Jackson, what does he really have? How much can you depend on him to be a starting caliber guy? Those are the things they still need to figure out.
How about one team that you're going to see a lot of this year, a divisional rival with Coach Bud taking over in Milwaukee? Giannis, I think, is a pretty viable MVP pick. I like the pace they've played with so far in the preseason and what they've shown. They seem to also be dedicated to making smarter decisions with their shot selection, in particular with threes. How are you feeling about their team this year, and how are you feeling about the Pistons seeing them so many times?
Yeah, in the Eastern Conference, you're going to see all those teams either 3 or 4 times, and Milwaukee is the one that you just kind of dread because there is no defender for Giannis, especially now that the 3 is falling at a little bit better clip for him in the preseason. That once that shot starts to fall, good luck with that. There's his strides and the way that he gets in the lane and then the long arms, the 7-foot wingspan, there's not much you can do with him. And I've talked to even some of the better defenders, the Stanley Johnsons, the Marcus Morrises that the Pistons have had, and say, what's the hard part about guarding Giannis? Is it that wingspan? And they said, no, it's that first step because he can be out at the elbow, and then you look and he takes one step and he's at the rim. So I think he'll have a very good year if that jumper starts falling even a little bit more. And the same thing when you look at some of the other guys, Markelle Fultz, Ben Simmons, guys who didn't have good jump shots. They've been working on them all summer, and you'll see some of the increases there with those guys.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense there. And also one thing with the Bucks, just to note real fast, I think Chris Middleton's in a contract year, and he seems like a guy who would love a contract year.
Yeah, he's gonna produce too. The Bucks are going to be one of those teams that I think, what were they, 20-1? The Vegas odds came out today, 20-1 to win the East. I think they've got something to prove because everybody's looking at Boston and Philly as the teams, in Toronto even as the 3 teams that are going to be at the top of the East. Watch out for the Bucks though, because I think they can put it together, especially under Coach Bud, and start to figure some of these things out.
This is kind of a general question that just popped into my head, but I think as a beat writer, you might be acutely aware of it. We've all kind of heard the rumors and hearsay of perhaps Houston being a bit of a trap location on the road. Some other cities, Miami, LA, place that I am right now. Occasionally you take the best of players. What cities do you feel like that actually might be true with?
In terms of trap cities on the road?
Yeah, trap cities, either like because of the nightlife or because of, the location itself. I mean, like, is there any that jump out to you as being like, oh yeah, they're going there. That's a schedule loss.
For the Pistons, it's been LA for a really long time. They won against the Clippers last year, and that was the first time.
Damn. Wait, Rod, I think we're losing you.
Yeah, I've always kind of wondered about LA because it's like these guys are celebrities and LA has that celebrity culture. I know, Chris, you live out there. Like, do you think these players just like enjoy it a little bit too much the night before the games?
I think there are certainly some places where you can notice a downtick in performance. I think Daryl, what's his last name? Daryl Morey on the Rockets GM has said before, that he believes that players who get forced out of Houston tend to come back with extra oomph because they love Houston and the nightlife and the social scene and all that so much. So when they get traded, they're extra angry. And I think we saw that actually last year with Corey Brewer. So they're one team that jumps out to me. But I'm curious. I feel like it might be a breach of writer code to give away too much.
No.
Players have too much fun in.
No, it's definitely Miami. Miami is the one that you've got to watch. And a couple of years ago, the Pistons played New Year's Eve in Miami, or New Year's Day in Miami, I want to say it was. And it was just a struggle when you got into shoot around that morning. But most guys were good about it and didn't stay out too late. But look at New Orleans, look at Houston, you mentioned, LA, New York or Brooklyn. I mean, those are some cities where things can happen late at night, and guys might not get a lot of sleep because of they're staying up and playing pinochle. Let's call it that.
Do you think that teams like the Pistons have extra trouble because the nightlife, like in Detroit, isn't maybe as good as LA? So like when they go to LA, it's different than if they're playing in Brooklyn and going to LA. Is there something?
No. Guys have their favorite cities that they like to go to, and I've heard stories of as soon as the team plane lands, they've got limos lined up on the tarmac at the airport to go out and go clubbing or to go wherever. I haven't seen that myself, but I've heard stuff like that in years past. But for the most part, guys are very responsible about making sure that when they get into a city, they have the fun that they need to have. But usually it's the night after a game or after the game is over that particular night.
One thing that's pretty popular in the DFS community in general is the idea of there being a narrative, like somebody's birthday or a revenge game, like we discussed a little bit a second ago. Have you ever seen that firsthand where you knew a guy was coming in with a certain motivation, either playing against a former team or, a player that he had some beef with that maybe, didn't reach the national media, but you were aware of it? Has there been something you've seen like that before where you're like, you know what, that guy went off and it made sense?
No, it was the Spencer Dinwiddie game with the Nets last year against the Pistons. And obviously the Pistons had drafted him in the second round, and they were looking to develop him, and it just didn't work out. He wasn't getting the playing time, but he hit the game-winning shot last year against the Pistons, and he wouldn't really talk about it on the record, but off the record, he was very satisfied that he was able to not only get the win, but to hit that game-winning shot.
That was a big game by him. I like Dinwiddie too. He seems like a good guy. He seems like he works hard on that Nets team where there's not a lot to work hard for.
Yeah, but he gets it, and he understands that in order to get that next opportunity, you've got to show that you can make it in Brooklyn or no matter where you are. And so he cherishes and relishes that opportunity to get out there and play and to show what he can do and that he is an NBA level caliber player. And I think he started to show that. He probably got jobbed out of the most improved player last year because he had a magnificent season, but it's in Brooklyn and people aren't going to know that they would in a bigger market.
So we were talking about shoot-around briefly, and I was kind of that kind of made me think of another topic I feel like you might have some insight on, where as DFS players, we're always trying to kind of read the tea leaves and read between the lines of like what they're saying about a guy's injuries. Like the guy's questionable, but he missed shoot-around, or he's questionable, but he participated at shoot-around, or all the different like levels of modifiers they might attach to like how bad the injury is. So what's the best way to kind of interpret all of these factors when we're trying to decide what are the chances that guy's going to play or not?
Well, there's questionable, and that's always kind of he's got something. There's some nagging injury there, but he's going to try to go. There's doubtful, which is don't even count on it. Even if he does play, he's probably not going to be at any kind of good 50%, 80%, whatever that you'd want to play him and expect any kind of good production out of him. And then there's just game time decision. Those are the worst because right before rosters are about to lock, then you're just still sitting there trying to wait and see. And sometimes we don't know until after rosters lock. And then when they make the announcement, then we'll know which guys are playing and which guys are healthy again. So those are kind of the designations. But again, I try to keep an eye on those things and let people know right after practice or right after shoot around on game day that, hey, this guy's questionable. And for the Pistons, it's Stanley Johnson. He's had a toe issue the past couple of days, and Dwane Casey called him questionable today. But again, start the season. He's going to play. I would think that he's going to play. And it's just a question of how much and how effective he's going to be.
Let's dial it back a little bit. Actually, let's talk about one big story before we kind of go into some thoughts of yours, Rod, on the general season this year coming up. But Jimmy Butler, obviously a big topic overall. You might maybe have some extra knowledge of him from being in the same division for a little bit, and obviously just having many sources across the league. How do you feel like that situation shakes out, and where do you think he ends up, or does he end up staying somehow?
It is it's tough. It's kind of like your college roommate that you don't really get along with, and you have to figure out a way to coexist in the same space, even though you hate each other's guts. And I think that's what the Timberwolves are dealing with is Jimmy Butler feels like the guy that's forgotten about, that you lock up Karl Anthony Towns long term, you lock up Andrew Wiggins long term, and he's going to want that same sort of long term deal, but they don't value him the same way as a cornerstone piece of what this franchise is going to be. And as a veteran, I think he's 30, that he's got a couple more good years with that's left in his career, but you're going to start seeing him go down a little bit in what his production is, but not his value to the team. Those guys still have to figure out and learn how to win. And I don't think the Timberwolves look at that as an opportunity that they're going to challenge in the West over the next few years at all.
So Andrew Wiggins is a player that I want to talk about briefly. And Jimmy Butler obviously relates because Jimmy Butler has always done pretty well and as far as advanced statistics, but Andrew Wiggins, his win shares per 48 is only 0.3 last year. His box score plus minus is minus 2.5. So all the advanced stats are kind of pointing in the direction that he's a below average player, but they're kind of treating him like a superstar. So what is it like that us like data inclined NBA people are missing that the coaches are seeing?
Well, I think there's a lot of that, and people have the stats that they like a little bit more than others. Some people look at win shares per 48 or production per 36 minute stuff as their gauge. I try to look at more recent trends and kind of what they've done in the last 4 or 5 games, or what they've done against a particular opponent or a particular matchup that's there. If a guy has an axe to grind, one that I always look at is Andre Drummond against Karl Anthony Towns. That's going to be a pound Towns game when Drummond comes in, because that's just a matchup that works for him. Andre Drummond against Dwight Howard, another one that he just feasts on time after time. So I don't do as much of the advanced stat stuff. Again, I do the Moet index and just say, hey, this looks like a good matchup because the last 4 or 5 times they played, this guy has eaten and done really, really well. Or they're going to run. This team's pace is a lot higher against this team in the last few matchups than it has been against anybody else. They've hit more threes, for example. So who do you think is going to be able to take advantage of an individual matchup from 3 more than another guy? So again, everybody has their own thing that they figure out that they like, and they're going to look at a matchup and say works for them. I don't do as much of that. Again, I don't have the same amount of time to do those things. But again, in the advice that I look at, hey, here's the last few times these guys have played. This is what has worked.
Has there been any sort of advanced stat you've seen? Because I think sometimes there tends to be, it sort of depends where the beat reporter or even a coach falls on the spectrum where they just don't buy certain stats. Have you ever seen one where you're like, you know what, like, I just don't see how this is relevant at all. And I don't see, like, this isn't what I see at all. Like, I guess because there's so many out there now, like basketball is becoming more like baseball. But are there any that jump off to you?
No, the one stat that I absolutely despise is plus minus in the box score, just the regular old plus minus, because it means nothing at all. It means that you were out there with the team that got just dusted off the floor, and you may have scored.
We'll get Rod back in a second. The connection can be tough, but plus minuses, I agree, are a terrible one. Alex, do you look at that at all?
I don't look at that one. There's one on Basketball Reference that's like I think it's adjusted to the context where it's just called BPM, and that one seems to average out. So like players on a good team could have a bad BPM or like. But I agree with Rod. Like just a regular box score plus minus is kind of hard to interpret. Like they used to use that as a stat in fantasy NHL, and there was so much like outrage about that they just like completely removed it.
Right, and it doesn't translate over to the NBA at all. The regular plus minus, because again, you can have in a box score, you can have excellent stats across the board, but the plus minus, well, everybody else on your team, you gave up a 15-0 run, but you scored 40 and you had 10 assists and 8 rebounds. That's a monster DFS night, but plus minus tells you that you had a horrible night. That's the one that I just absolutely get incensed at when I see a guy is plus 20, but he scored 2 points. Well, great. Thanks for being around.
Well, there goes our next section all about plus minuses. I guess has there been a guy who you've seen who, the numbers told you, I would assume I would rather go the positive way, where the numbers told you, oh, this guy's contributing anything, like an Al Horford type, I guess would be the best example that everybody would know. But has there been a player you've seen in your experience either on the Pistons side or the opponent side where you're like, that guy is affecting this game and nobody even will tell when they look at the box score tomorrow?
I think Ish Smith does that. And Reggie Bullock, I mean, that's your guy again. Mm-hmm. He might not score 20 or 25, but he might score a solid 10, and he'll score 10 for 5 straight games. And you say, well, okay, he's just kind of there. But the more eye-popping numbers are the Reggie Jacksons, the Blakes, and the Andre Drummonds. But the consistency is there for Reggie Bullock, that a night in and night out basis, he's going to give you a predictable amount, and you can just bet on that the numbers are going to be there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad we got another Reggie Bullock plug in there. He's going to be happy when he watches this show. He's going to be relaxing in Brooklyn tonight, and he's going to be like, "Oh, those guys really gave me a shout out. I appreciate it." I guess let's talk a little more about the potential breakout players while we have let's say 10 minutes or so left. What are you seeing so far, Rod, in terms of teams that might be, guys might be able to make that jump? We talked about the Pistons guys, but across the league, who are the guys you feel like are bubbling underneath and people need to be aware of now rather than later?
Yeah, I think Karis LeVert is certainly one. We mentioned him a little bit earlier, but I think he's going to take a bigger role. And with your D'Angelo Russells handling the ball a little bit, you might see a little bit more of LeVert with that second group coming in and handling the ball a little bit more. Trey Burke, another name that we know from the Knicks, he's getting a starting job in New York. And so I look forward to him getting some minutes. I don't know how effective he can be there, but again, I think that's significant that he got the starting job and they're moving Frank Ntilikina over to the shooting guard spot. With the Sixers, I think Markelle Fultz is going to have another good year where he's actually getting some playing time and just going to be healthy. And Ben Simmons, if that jumper starts to fall, I think that's another guy that you look at and say, hey, depending on the cost, and that's the key with all of these, is just what's the cost going to be and does it really make sense? Because a guy who can have a breakout year is going to be overpriced and it's not going to give you the value that you need from it.
That makes a lot of sense. Alex, who are you looking at this year, I guess, with your numbers that you look at every day and pour over? Is there anybody that jumps out to you as a guy who maybe you want to make Rod aware of when he sees him on the road or at home?
So far I've just I've been focusing mostly on these 4 teams playing tonight, but actually I'm finding the inverse, where like the teams are so healthy now that I think there's a lot of candidates for people whose roles might not be the same. And one that, Rod, you're familiar with is Marcus Morris. So
yeah,
I mean, with Gordon Hayward back, it's just one other star player kind of taking all the minutes. So what do you think like is going to happen to Morris kind of with Boston having such a deep rotation?
Well, I think he's going to certainly suffer from a production standpoint. The numbers aren't going to be as big, but I think the quality of what he gives you during that time is going to be. And he's a guy who's always a shoot first guy. He gets the ball around when he needs to, but when the ball comes to him in the post or right on the elbow, he's ready to shoot that thing. He's not worried about that at all. So I think he's going to have a solid season. He might not have a great numbers-wise production season, and really trying to fit in. How do you fit Kyrie back into that mix? How does Gordon Hayward? We hadn't seen him since the opener last year. How do those guys all come together and make all of that work with another seat at the table, if you will, for the stars that were hurt at the end of the year? That's what I'm interested in seeing. And again, it's going to take a game or two to figure all of these things out. But that initial indication is that it's going to work for Boston.
Yeah, Boston has a lot of talent on that team, and I'm curious to see actually how they shake out tonight. I mean, especially because I don't see how they get minutes for all those bodies that are going to be well deserved. I feel like there's going to be a lot of unhappiness there pretty fast, especially for Terry Rozier, a guy who's in a contract year and is looking for that next big deal.
Yeah, and if that doesn't work out for those guys, again, they can package some of that stuff together and figure out a trade that works ahead of the deadline if they really feel like they're right there. And for a lot of teams, you're going to gauge that right before the trade deadline in mid-January, late January, try to figure out how you can make some substantive changes to try to make that push toward the playoffs for the remainder of the year. So I think Boston might be right in there if they figure out, hey, we can't find minutes for all of these guys. Maybe we need to trade and upgrade and get another big man who's going to be effective. That might be another option for them.
Is there anybody out in the West who you're particularly interested in seeing this year? I guess maybe we could accept the obvious LeBron question, but if he's your guy, we can ask that too.
Well, I think Ingram is the guy to watch there. Is with LeBron, another guy who can create and get him the ball in good spots. How's that going to work out? Lonzo Ball over there as well. If he's not going to start, if they're giving the ball to Rajon Rondo, what does that mean for Ball if he's going to come in and just play backup point guard minutes? If he even plays backup point guard minutes, because if LeBron is in that second group and he's still handling, does Ball come in and have to become a shooter on the weak side with LeBron handling so much? That's one that I'm really, really interested in, probably from an inverse negative standpoint of how much does that affect what he's able to do.
Yeah, I would agree there. I think, there's a lot of things that factors in. I think one thing that people are forgetting about the Lakers too is just the pace they play at. And if LeBron does play 33 minutes a game and he plays 82 games playing at that pace, he's going to have a historically great year even for him. I'm curious to see how it shakes out because I think they're going to have to adjust some things on the fly like they had to do last year in Cleveland as well.
No, and I think Anthony Davis is another one that there is no sharing with DeMarcus Cousins this year. He is the guy, and you're just going to have to feed him consistently every night, but he's going to have big, big numbers there. I think he could lead the league in scoring. He could be an MVP type candidate out in New Orleans because there's not going to be as much sharing that he's going to have to do, sharing that load with Boogie Cousins.
That makes a lot of sense. Alex, how about you? What about players that you're kind of targeting and that you think might be interesting, either from, a spot where they're going to be underpriced to start the year or just anybody in general?
So one spot I'm really interested in is the Hawks are really changing. They're changing gears this year. Last year they brought on the former assistant GM of the Warriors, Travis Schlenk, and I read this article today I thought was really interesting that he's trying to recreate the success of the Warriors. So obviously they drafted Trae Young. He's supposed to be like maybe the next Steph Curry, people are saying. Of course, Stephen Curry wasn't like a star player right off the starting block. But I think if that's really what they're going for, I could see the Hawks kind of speeding up their pace a lot. And that being really good for fantasy, both for them and for their opponents.
I'll give you another team that you can watch is the Nuggets. I think they've got a really interesting mix of scorers and multi-talented guys. I mean, everybody knows about Nikola Jokic and what kind of stat stuffer he is, but he could have easily 15 triple-doubles this year and have a nice spread of that talent. Gary Harris is there, Jamal Murray is coming along. We've seen Will Barton and Paul Millsap. Those guys can really contribute to Jokic having another outstanding type year, averaging a double-double. But those numbers push up a little bit more because I think they're a winning team. They're maybe somewhere around the 5, 6, 7 seed in the West. I think they can have a really good year.
Yeah, as long as Isaiah Thomas doesn't pull his old special. Just numbering everything somehow just by existing, poor guy.
Yeah, just by breathing on it. But I think they've got a good mix. I think that's going to be – but playing out in the West, you're going to get beat up night after night after night. So that's something I'm interested in is seeing how the numbers shake out between East teams and West teams from a DFS perspective that might be a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think too, the Nuggets are a good team. Alex, I'm with you though. The Hawks, I think, could be a fun, bad team, which I love the most. Like the Nets, I enjoyed a lot last year. The Suns, I enjoyed watching their games. Teams that play at pace and are at least trying and putting effort forward are interesting. And the Hawks are already shaping up to be a pretty compelling spot to watch this year. I guess, Rod, has there been a team that you watched where you're like, these guys aren't good, but they're fun? Like, like maybe, I don't know if there's an analogy that comes ahead right away, but anybody you've seen like that on the road?
Fun but good. Fun but not good. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's not Phoenix. Phoenix was not good and not fun either. That was just because you've got to have something where you say, at least they're trying out here. I'm going to say Brooklyn. Brooklyn was my team last year that if they start to get it together, that's a team that could really start to turn the whole Titanic around and Titanic almost literally that they're not really close to winning. But once they get it together, probably one or two more players, they can start to figure things out a little bit more.
Yeah, Kenny Atkinson, a very good coach, very underrated. And again, if people don't watch bad basketball, they don't know that.
You got to have the stomach for bad basketball.
Just a league pass account and enough time on your hands, Rod. That's all I need in my life.
No, and I'll tell you, the Heat are fun to watch too. That's another team that I like, that kind of just plays. There is no real star there. You wouldn't consider Hassan Whiteside a guy that he's an all-star caliber player, but not a guy that you sit down and watch and say, hey, that's my guy. But the Heat are a really, really scrappy team that just finds their way to make the wins.
Yeah, I agree. There was actually, just to plug it real fast, there was an interesting piece on The Ringer this week about Hassan Whiteside and kind of talking about how he went through last year. And I thought it was interesting as somebody who was really frustrated with him in DFS last year. But I think, Rod, obviously you see this more than anybody. There are human beings behind it. Hassan Whiteside definitely seemed like he had a tough time last year dealing with the frustrations at him. And he's an interesting guy. I would encourage people to read that piece and think about the humanity of it all.
Yeah.
Let's, you know what, Rod, we got you here. We got to put you on the spot. What are your picks, I guess, coming out of the East and coming out of the West this year?
I'm going to be boring. I'll say Boston and Golden State. I just don't think that there would have to be something catastrophic to happen for Golden State to not be able to reach it. I don't think Houston plays enough D, and we saw that in the series last year, that when it comes down to it, they can't get that stop that they need, and you can't rely on the three-pointer that much and not have some complementary inside piece to go along with it. And adding DeMarcus Cousins was, I don't want to say embarrassing, but it was just, are you serious? I mean, it was the same thing when they added Kevin Durant. It's almost like, okay, well, what else do you need? It's a cheat code as it is, but DeMarcus Cousins now is just sort of okay, your weakest position was center, and now you go out and get the guy who's probably the most versatile and probably the best overall pure center out there. Come on. I mean, so I think it'll be a good dynamic to see. And the question is, how does Golden State get there? What types of bumps in the road do they have to overcome in order to get there? Houston is going to be waiting in the wings. The LeBron element over in the West is going to help that a little bit. But in the East, I think it's going to be Boston, that their depth and their level of talent is just going to be too much for any of the teams over there.
That's a fair pick, and also a pretty good pick in terms of the Vegas odds too. So you're right in line there, Rod. Alex, give us your picks too. You're under the spot now. You're going against a real big brain in the actual world of sports. Your data won't save you now, buddy.
My specialty. Like I'm only good at predicting what will happen in one game, but I think I have to agree with Rod. The Warriors, I don't think anyone can beat them. I think just looking at the East, the best roster is the Celtics. They just have so many solid players, and obviously Kyrie Irving, Gordon Hayward. Those are guys who can be totally elite. But the problem is the fact that Golden State Warriors just have 4 elite players means that having 8 really good players isn't really going to win you a championship. So that's the problem I think we're facing.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think, what Rod said about Cousins coming in, I think it's actually going to help the Warriors out. There's not as much stagnation this year. They have some new fresh blood in who should keep them more motivated. So I would go Warriors Bucks. I'm all in on the Giannis train. I'm all in on Coach Bud guiding him to greatness. And I think it's an interesting team that you're going to see a lot of this year, Rod. Rod, any parting words for the folks before we go let you enjoy the fruits of New York?
Well, Chris, I'm going to say, if you're thinking the Bucks, then it's 20-1 odds in Vegas. Take a 50, put it down, and then we'll all go get to have a good dinner together somewhere when that pays off for you.
I'll do it for all of us. Just a sacrifice in the name of respecting our beat writers.
Again, I'll put the thought out there that if any DFS players are looking at engaging with beat writers, certainly do it. And as I go around the league, I try to encourage more people that it's not going to hurt anything they're doing. It doesn't really take significantly more time for them to try to engage with their DFS folks. And if it's about followers on Twitter, I mean, in the day that I decided, hey, I'm going to really take a deep dive into DFS, I think I got 1,000 or 2,000 followers in a day, which is ridiculously good. But I haven't had a negative interaction with a DFS player. And that's the thing that beat writers fear is I'm not going to go into this, spend more time, and then people just crap on anything that I tell them. No, DFS people appreciate the time that you give. And any number of people have said, hey, I won $1,000 off a tip that you gave me. You told me Ish was going to have a good night, and he did. I won $1,000. And so I don't take any of the money. If somebody gets a 5-figure win, then we can talk. I might take my cut from that. But yeah, if you won $1,000, absolutely good job, and continue on with that success.
Yeah, be nice. Positivity breeds positivity. Be nice to your beat writers. They're just trying to help you out and do a very valuable job, which frankly, in a changing media landscape is not appreciated enough. So I appreciate you, Rod. Alex, any parting words for the folks before we let everybody go?
Yeah. Well, thanks for everyone for watching. Thanks, Chris, for hosting. Rod, I really appreciate your reporting. I remember one night Reggie Jackson was scratched like 2 minutes before the game tipped off, and because you sent out that tweet and I was following you, I was able to late swap him out.
That's how it works. It worked well then.
But that's why you want to follow guys like Rod, because the information comes fastest straight from the source. Thank you for coming on our show and kind of educating us all about your insight and also what it's like just being a reporter, how we can use your information. And I hope that everyone got some great nuggets out of it.
No, I had fun. Let's do this again sometime.
Hopefully do this again. Everybody go follow Rod at Det News, Rod Beard on Twitter. He's one of the good guys out there, really working hard to make sure that you know all the things you need to know. Go follow Osmo as well. Also working hard, not as hard as Rod, I'm sure, but working hard to keep us all employed and keep the lights on. Go follow him at Osmo DFS. Like and subscribe. Keep your eyes peeled to this channel because I'll be back in just a few short minutes with Fast Steady Fear to talk more NBA and tonight's slate. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Alex. See you guys again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rod.